I do welcome the opportunity to once again address the House on the issue of the report of the working group to examine defects in housing and to inform deputies of the steps government is taking to provide support to those homeowners who find themselves in a really difficult situation through absolutely no fault of their own. Can I just at the outset thank deputies across the House. I know from time to time we will have sometimes charged discussions or disagreements with regard to policy and that. I think in this particular issue, in the main, we've been able to work very constructively together. The next phase is very important, obviously, which is moving to government decision implementation and really start to help people to get their homes and their lives back together. But I fully acknowledge the difficulties that homeowners and residents of many apartments and duplexes are facing and the stress that it has caused when defects arise in relation to their buildings, and where there have been many instances of failure and non-compliance concerns coming to light in apartment buildings, particularly those built during the building boom, many of which are in my own constituency. I'll know residents, friends, constituents personally who have been living with this awful situation. And I did say that as Minister I'd grasped the nettle on this and that government would as well, and we're doing that. Actually, just for the information of the House, earlier this week hosted a webinar with affected residents right the way across the country with over 290 participants, and I want to thank the Construction Defects Alliance and Apartment Owners Network as well for facilitating that, where I was able to answer questions directly to residents right across the country. I thought it was very useful, and I'll continue to do that. I've committed to another session with residents as well in Q1 next year. As I've already mentioned, there are thousands of residents across the country. We estimate probably about 100,000 properties, thousands in my own area of Dublin Fingal, the area I represent, have been affected by these issues of construction defects and fire defects. And I have worked and campaigned on this since the first day I came into the Dáil way back in 2007. When I was Fianna Fáil opposition spokesperson on housing, I called for a scheme to be put in place and for us to work together to help residents, not just to put their homes back together, but to help them put their lives back together. And that is why in the programme for government negotiations, we sought and received a firm and clear commitment that the nettle of construction defects will be grasped and dealt with once and for all. This commitment was further supported by actions contained in Housing for All. In this regard, I established the working group to examine defects in housing. The working group was chaired by Seamus Neely, former CEO of Donegal County Council, and its membership comprised of professionals from a range of backgrounds, including fire safety, engineering, architecture, chartered surveying, legal and public sector. But in recognition of the importance of hearing the voice of those directly affected by this issue, 2 members of the group were nominated by the Construction Defects Alliance and the Apartment Owners Network. And I really want to take this opportunity to commend all of those, my own officials as well, who worked so hard through the working group, the work they undertook in preparing the most comprehensive report in what was a very tight time frame. That group set their own terms of reference. I didn't set a time frame for them either, and they concluded their work in a very efficient and professional manner. The working group set its own terms of reference, as I said, and it focused specifically on fire safety, structural safety and water ingress defects in purpose-built apartment buildings, including duplexes, constructed in the period between 1991 and 2013. I received the report of the working group at the end of July, and given the importance of its work, I did not pressure the group into finishing the report sooner or indeed speeding it up. They needed the time to consider the scope and scale of the issue. The level of consultation and engagement from the working group undertook with stakeholders and interested parties both here and abroad was extremely extensive. As a result, the report is rich in data regarding the nature and scale of defects, as well as the cost of addressing defects. Some 28,000 homes participated in a survey undertaken by the working group, and as a result, for the first time, we have a real proper handle on the type of defects and the scale and scope of those defects, and indeed the breakdown within that. The report found what many of us here know to be the case, that fire defects are the most prevalent of the defects. It's estimated between 40 and 70% of the properties are affected by fire defects. Water ingress affected between 20% and 50%, while structural defects, though still very important, affected somewhat fewer, estimated between 5 and 25%. We now also have a handle on the average cost, although I'm aware that some residents are being presented with bills well in excess of that amount. But the average cost, as far as we could estimate, is approximately £25,000 per unit, which means a potential cost to the Exchequer ranging between £1.5 billion and £2.5 billion. I'm also acutely aware that many residents have already remediated their homes. Up to 12% of properties have been fixed and made safe, and just over a third of other affected properties are either in the process of being fixed or work is being planned to undertake that remediation work. I'm now moving on to implement the recommendations, many of the recommendations contained in the report of the working group. Firstly, on the 27th of September last, I brought a memorandum to inform Government of the content of the report and of the next steps that I plan to take. Secondly, I established the Interdepartmental and Agency Group, which will consider the recommendations contained in the working group report and to elaborate on the options for the potential sources of financial support and the potential channels for deployment contained within the report. And I received the final report of this group just yesterday. Thirdly, an advisory group has been established to develop a code of practice in the context of the Fire Services Acts to provide guidance to building professionals and local authority building control services and indeed our local authority fire services. In addition to the development of this code of practice, a separate code of practice has been developed as a result of a specific recommendation in the 2018 Fire Safety in Ireland report. This code of practice, which is due for publication shortly, will provide a framework for the ongoing management and maintenance of buildings with respect to fire safety and contains guidance specific to buildings containing flats and apartments. It will provide clarity and consistency of approach nationally in making reasonable provisions for occupant safety. It is expected that this code of practice will be of assistance to building owners and operators in providing standard guidance and advice on the range of duties with respect to fire safety. It will complement and provide updated guidance to the existing suite of guidance documents published by my department. Fourthly, my department is engaging with the Housing Agency for the provision of advice in relation to the implementation of the recommendations of the working group. In parallel to the steps that I've just spoken about, I have met with and corresponded with homeowner representative groups, as I've mentioned, the Construction Defects Alliance, Apartment Owners Network, and indeed residents from specific estates, and I'm committed to keeping them updated on progress. As I mentioned earlier on, we had a very well-attended webinar earlier this week with just short of 300 residents and residents groups attending. And I thought that was a really very useful exchange of views, but it also further broke down the scale of the complexities within it of different situations that people find themselves in. And I really do want to thank all those who shared those stories with me. And actually, the feedback that we received from that meeting will form part of a further submission that we're working on too. I have heard that the excess levels on insurance policies also held by residents of some apartment blocks are effectively set that high that it nearly deems those apartments uninsured. I have had a positive initial engagement with Insurance Ireland in relation to this, and I'll continue that engagement as matters progress. We'll also be engaging as well with the banks also, and particularly mortgage lenders as we move through the process. But I think it was an important engagement with Insurance Ireland to inform them as to where government is going with this, because we would like to see the sector taking a different view with regard to insurance, as they can actually see that this work is now going to, that the work in relation to remediation and a government scheme on remediation is going to start. And I also advised residents of that at the meeting on Monday. I'm also engaging with the Housing Agency in regard to the provision of advice in relation to the implementation of that report. I do intend to bring a further memorandum to Government next week, setting out proposals in more detail. And I wish to assure residents of affected apartments and duplexes that this government will help. We will help them get their homes and their lives back together, but we do need a robust scheme, and it will take a bit of time to bring the legislation required to underpin such a scheme. And I've advised deputies of that last week also. In the meantime, though, as we discussed last week, there will be interim measures that we can take, subject to Cabinet approval, and we should take them, in my view. I don't want people who have planned work already holding off on that work, particularly on the fire safety side, waiting for a scheme to come through. I think all deputies, in fairness, across the House and my government colleagues fully understand the need to have a scheme that's grounded in primary legislation. But I do think there's interim measures that we can take, and I will be bringing forward proposals in that regard to Cabinet next week. The hundreds, if not thousands, of people right across the country who I've met in respect of construction defects deserve that response and that help from government, and they will get it. I can assure them of that. As I mentioned, we do need bespoke legislation. We cannot, in my view, and I know there's been other suggestions in that regard, to use existing legislation. I don't believe that's the way forward. I do appreciate the suggestion. Having said that, but I think we can work together on bespoke legislation in this regard, and I will be seeking the continued cooperation and support of members opposite when we bring forward this legislation. The Joint Oireachtas Committee on Housing will have a very important role in that, and the members on the committee are very experienced in this issue too. So I think that will actually very much help the deliberation and the structure of the scheme. We can make sure that it's robust and it moves forward. There are other elements within this. It's not just a question of how we structure a scheme. We also got to be clear about how it will be rolled out and how we categorise the different defects within it, such as in the case of the apartment blocks and estates that are affected. We will do so using the principle of remediating the worst first. I think that we have to do that, and with a particular focus on fire safety. We will then have to deal with the issue of certification. When works are carried out, we need them obviously to be carried out by experienced and qualified professionals, but the work needs to be certified, and that certification needs to be accepted, particularly within the insurance sector, within the banking sector too. So we'll need to ensure that when work's done, it is properly certified so the homes can be properly insured should a homeowner so wish. Also, it can be sold with the value of that home reinstituted. As Minister, I'm absolutely committed to bringing this scheme forward, getting Cabinet approval for it, moving on the interim measures that can assist people now, and then moving forward with the legislation to put the scheme on a solid basis from which we can move on. I will continue to make good on the commitment we put into the programme for government to tackle this issue once and for all, make people's homes safe, and allow them to get back on with their own lives. I campaigned for that in opposition, and I'm now in a position to do something about that as Minister in this government. To conclude, I do welcome the opportunity to debate this matter this afternoon. I look forward to updating colleagues again in the Dáil following Cabinet approval, should I receive same next week. And I would suggest that early in the new session that we would return to this, where we can look at the recommendations and work it through. I do think we'll have the Joint Oireachtas Committee as well, that we will get involved then, but I am very anxious that we can move on interim measures and what we can do now in advance of a scheme, so that people can continue, or work that's scheduled, that they can go ahead and do it, but there will be a particular focus on fire safety. There are other very important issues such as water ingress, obviously structural. I think we've got to look at the fire safety piece for people's safety first by way of the interim measures. I will also be bringing deputies as part of my memorandum next week for discussion to government the whole issue of retrospection. There's about 12%, probably 12, 13, 14% of properties we know have been already remediated, and they're fixed. We've got to make sure that they're properly certified and the work is done, and we take it that that is the case. So that is an issue that came forward very strongly within the working group report. I know residents in my own constituency who have who have fixed their own homes to great cost to them and to their management companies as well, increased levies, substantially increased. My own belief is that we need to help them too, but we need to continue and really focus on the work of the apartments and the homes that are not remediated now, particularly from a safety perspective. So I look forward to the contributions from deputies opposite and the deputies in government here this afternoon. And as I said, just to reconfirm, I will be bringing forward a memorandum to government next week at Cabinet, and look forward to the contributions from deputies opposite. Thank you.